Hilma's Ghost. It's also interesting because I know you individually as artists, and I was really surprised actually to see, and positively surprised to see your tarot cards at the Armory last fall. And I'm sure you will talk about these works today.
You want to give a little description on Hilma's Ghost, and then I'll...
Yeah, sure. So I think, first of all, I mean, Dannielle and I, are both independent artists. And we met several years ago because we had studios next to each other. Dannielle had been at the Elizabeth Foundation in New York for many, many years. And I had actually just returned from India, and that was my first studio in New York City. And of course, my neighbor was Dannielle, who was very friendly and warm and generous. And so, we became friends and colleagues. And we both work with abstraction. My roots for abstraction were came from South Asia. I was looking at textiles, I was looking at miniatures, I was looking at Tantra painting, and Dannielle was looking at constructivism, the Bauhaus, and so forth. And so we really were looking at abstraction through very different lenses, had looked at each other's works, but it was only several years later, during the pandemic 2 years ago. I mean, of course, we're kind of still in the pandemic, but really at the the peak of the pandemic in 2020, where we started to talk a lot more, and we were, of course, all isolated. We couldn't go to our studios. We couldn't have the communities that we had access to, and so we were really thinking about how to connect, communities of artists together, specifically women, non-binary and trans artists, basically artists that had been left out of kind of art history and the canon. Both of us have spiritual practices of our own, and we were really tapping into that a lot more during the pandemic. We were kind of getting more interior, looking inward, and Hilma's Ghost was born.
Yeah, well, just to add on to that, and first of all, I just want to take a moment, because that's such an amazing film. No matter how many times I see it, I'm just so blown away every single time. Like, it's just amazing. And I love what Josiah said in the film, and I know Josiah is a friend of mine, and he says that now it's time for Hilma to go out really and affect other artists' work, really. And that's exactly kind of what happened to us. And I mean, years ago, I don't know a single female artist in New York who was not completely blown away by this show. And, we go to hundreds of shows and 20 years of shows. And really, it was the one show, I think, that affected artists so incredibly deeply in so many ways.
Why do you think that was?
Well, it's a good question. I mean, I think it's such an incredible different constellation of circumstances. I mean, first of all, the miracle that work stayed together in a group and was almost in a way unexposed, and then to be able to see it in that way. And I don't want to say, I'm going to get a little new agey, that it's hard to look at those drawings. And we say, by the way, that we're believing skeptics, even though we have worked with shamans and witches all year with this project. So, it's hard to really look at those drawings, those diagrams that she made, and then look at where this ended up in the Guggenheim and just think, oh my God, what was really destined in some way. And that, I feel like personally, we don't know everything about the universe. And when you see something like that, it was, I think, really significant spiritually for artists. I think it was a really spiritual moment. Mm-hmm. And just to connect into what Sharmistha was saying about how Hilma's Ghost came about, of course, 2 years ago we went into deep lockdown, and I'm a professor at CUNY, so all of a sudden I was not teaching my students, and I was locked out of my studio for 5 months, and I started something called the Pandemic Salon. So I was hosting a salon every week from my house with topics, and I'd bring in writers and artists and poets and musicians, and they were around topics. And it was a great way to connect and really support one another. And then when, continuing on, that's really kind of in some ways gave birth to Sharmistha and I having conversations of, we wanted to do this really for feminism and artists that had not been recognized in some ways. And we started an Instagram account where we were profiling forgotten women artists. We started doing virtual programming. We collaborated with 8 different practitioners, so a shaman, a witch, someone coming in to do automatic drawing, and they were workshops, so you would come and they were all free, and we would give a historic overview of art and that subject, and then you would have really a workshop, and that's really how it was born in some ways.
And do you think the pandemic was conducive to people or particular artists to be more open again to spiritualism? I mean, I think people were looking for answers, and artists could provide that. And it was such a special moment. And it's also interesting that the show at the Guggenheim happened just before the pandemic. Just like a year before.
Yeah. As Dannielle said, the exhibition of Hilma of Klint's at the Guggenheim, was just, it was like a miracle. I mean, I know that word is kind of associated with kind of mysticism, and not kind of like hard Western rationalism, and, but it really felt like that. I mean, and I think it's across ages, races, gender. I mean, we have assistants we work with who are deeply impacted by it, who are art students now. There are, artists who are in their 70s and 80s, who are part of our community, who were deeply impacted by that exhibition. So, I think just across the board, there was just this really deep impact of that exhibition. And I think the pandemic, in a way, gave us an opportunity to really go deeper and explore not only what Hilma had done, but also how that connects in with the stories or the experiences of so many artists, mainly women, and these stories had been completely written out. I mean, I also, love art history, and I felt like I had been lied to for 20 years, I love the history of abstraction, and it was like, well, why didn't anyone tell me about this, And so it's art history in the making, and it shows you that the art history that has been written is not static, it's dynamic, and it's changing, and and it makes you think about what else is out there to be discovered. If this has been kept secret for so long, and hasn't come out into the public, then what else is there? And there's that sense of kind of engagement now again with kind of art history and seeing it as kind of a dynamic thing.
Right, and it's almost like she knew that was going to happen. She foresaw that.
And I also just think with the pandemic, I think just with all of our experience over the past 2 years, the amount of death and loss that all of us have gone through, I don't know how you can't really not start grappling with ideas of the unseen and death. And of course, when you look over history, you see the incredible rise of spiritualism or interest in these ideas when people go through wars or other, times of loss or famines or things like that. So it's nothing new, but it is absolutely amazing that the Hilma show, first of all, came right before it and kind of opened this portal in a way. But, we're absolutely seeing, when we started doing these virtual programs, we thought we'd have, 25 people, 30 people, and we were getting 500 people. And at some points, we were having people signing in from 40 different countries. We just couldn't even figure out where they were finding us. We were like, who are these people? But everyone was interested in this.
Amazing.
It was amazing. Incredible. We would just sit there and watch the Zoom, and we'd be like, who are these people from everywhere? From Malta. How did they find it? So I just think there's an incredible, interest in these ideas, of course, because of what we're coming out of. But I also think it just connects to, and this was mentioned in the film, that we've become, in many ways, much more of a secular society, but we've also become incredibly disconnected from nature and from, natural systems, and we've just been, destroying our world. And
The
I think
unseen and the inexplicable.
absolutely,
I
and
think
we're really
but
grappling
then
with
we have
it.
to learn to look at that again.
And of course, when you look at witchcraft or other things that have been, of course, criticized, or people like it's really about getting back to those natural rhythms in many ways, and back to land, and back to the connections to, the rhythms of your life, and in dying, and in illness, and in birth, and so forth.
Yeah. Can you talk about the tarot cards?
Yeah, why don't you
They are
go ahead.
absolutely stunning.
Well,
And
Abstract
how do
Futures
you-
Tarot.
How do you work together? I mean, you literally create them together, right?
Yeah. So I don't know if you're familiar with tarot, but it was a system of playing cards for centuries, and it was a Rider-Waite deck that was designed also illustrated by Pamela Coleman Smith, turn of century, who is also an overlooked and forgotten woman artist. And the only reason she's remembered is because of the Rider-Waite deck. It is apparently 100 million copies of the deck in worldwide distribution. It's the most widely distributed deck, and it actually has her monogram on it, PCS. And so that's how she's kind of been recovered somewhat. And apparently the Whitney Biennial has a work of hers in it now, which is kind of quite astonishing. But so, Dannielle and I, of course, were quite content to have these online programs and build this community.
We never intended to even make anything together, so.
I mean, that thought may have crossed our minds.
Decades-long practice,
Yeah, I mean, we may have thought about it conceptually, but it was like, like when you conceptually think about it, it's like, how would that work? So we were doing these online programs, during the pandemic, and of course we had lots of people signing on, and we had this Instagram page, profiling, women, non-binary and trans artists. And then, it was actually Carrie Secret's gallery, who was Dannielle's gallery in Chicago, applied to the Armory show with a special project of Hilma's ghost.
And didn't tell us.
And
we had never made work together.
And we've never made, so how this got accepted, we have no idea how this even got accepted.
It was Hilma.
It was Hilma. And so the project was accepted, and then she told us, and we're like, well, now we have to make work together.
And they're like, 78 cards?
There's 78
cards. I'll talk a little bit about the tarot.
Course.
So, there's 78 cards, and there are, 4 different suits and major arcana, like death and Wheel of Fortune and so forth. And so just a little bit about the process that, and we get asked this a lot, like, how do you collaborate? And, we both, again, have very long practices making works on our own, and either one of us, we've never collaborated with a visual artist. So, it was just, every day we went to the studio, and I will say we did try to be authentic in that we lit candles and we saged the studio, and we have a witch we now work with, Sarah Potter, who's a pretty famous witch, who's kind of been along the ride with us with this, and we would really do sigils in the studio and really set the tone and really try to set a sacred space to make work, which is something that we had never done before, by the way, in either one of our works. And I say in some ways we probably make work like jazz musicians, that we would make drawings, and then I would give them to Sharmistha, and then Sharmistha would kill them, and I would get them back, and it went back, and it would go back and forth. And we spent probably 300 to 400 hours making 78 drawings and then 5 paintings. So
what was the material that you?
Yeah, well, we'll show you some drawings.
Yeah.
The materials are paper, ink, gouache, colored pencil, and then the paintings are ink and acrylic mostly.
And how big were the original paintings?
They're 14 by 17 inches.
No, so these are actually, these ones right here are 9.75 by 17 inches. It's actually proportional to
They're an art
the most
historian, if you
popular.
can't
Sorry, it's just like I nerd out on this stuff, but So it's the proportional to the, the most popular size of the tarot card. So we wanted to obviously kind of stay true to that with the dimensions of the drawings. They're done on this beautiful dyed Italian paper called Fabriano Murillo, and we work with gouache, ink, and watercolor. And it's interesting because Dannielle and I have very different visual, we have very different approaches, and we're also visually, we have a very different idea of, what abstraction is. So I'm really kind of like, if you see the bright hot colors, those are mine. And then Danielle, has a more muted palette, kind of more spare in terms of her language. And I'm kind of like, let's just cover up the whole paper, maximalist. And so when Dannielle
this
talks
would give
about—
me a heart attack looking at it. So
well,
it's it's interesting when you work if there are constraints back and forth, right? So it forces you to think and grow in a different way.
I think that's what's really remarkable about that work that you created together, because I know both of your work, and it's very different. And you've created something completely new. It's really its own thing. It's Hilma's ghost. So it's really something.
Do you want to go
new.
to this?
And I'm really interested in that sort of collaborative spirit and how that can really work.
Yeah, we would, also invoke Hilma, of course. So we'd like to think that she's in the work along with Pamela Coleman-Smith. But I do want to describe something that Dannielle says about killing the work, is that, if I did something that Dannielle was like, oh my God, what did you just do? She would kind of, usually like if I put so much color in it, she'd go in with the grays. And so it became kind of a running joke. And I think, talking about kind of the process of collaboration, I think you really have to have a sense of humor and be good friends and not be too attached to what you've done, because it is a conversation, and there is this process of like transformation that happens in the work that you both are kind of open to.
I think also in collaboration, this is something I think that musicians and actors know quite well, that when you collaborate, it can, and it works, it really can elevate you, and you can make something that you can't without. Visual artists don't really understand this because we're not really trained in that way. We're trained to be very individualistic, and I think what's amazing about Hilma, frankly, is all these seances and things that she did, and that it was really almost a collaborative spirit. And of course, then she talks about like channeling these other spirits, and so there's a collaborative energy in that already, which I think is really fascinating. Do you want to go through it?
Yeah.
Yeah, the film didn't talk too much about who she collaborated with. It talked about her solitude in the work, but it seems like she did collaborate, and she founded this group with 4 other women.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
I thought that was
a
interesting.
consistent collaboration.
Yeah. So that's the show at the Armory.
Yeah, and this is, you can see the 78 drawings. So you have the major arcana, which is about life's transformational shifts. You have the pentacle suit, the swords, and the cups, and the wands. And these really are extremely layered, in terms of the symbolism, the narratives. And I think that one thing that, we should say is that we were also doing this in abstraction, and the tarot is, primarily figurative. It is narrative. It is about stories. It is very layered, with symbolism. And for us, it was like, how do we do this? How do we translate that into an abstract language?
I think you want to just show the other few, and we can answer questions.
Oh, yeah.
We have time.
We have time?
Okay.
Oh, okay. So these are do you want to talk about the paintings?
Yeah, so the paintings, and this is some things that we're doing in the studio now as well, is we would create a reading of 4 or 5 cards, and then meld those symbols in our cards. And so there's a reading that goes along with this painting. The witch that I mentioned actually does the reading, and it is part of the title of the work. So it's almost very much like a talismanic painting, right, of this reading kind of embedded into it in some ways.
And then we, do different kind of initiations with these.
And it's there behind me.
Yeah, you're embarking upon a new journey. That's the title. It's if the title
is the title.
The whole thing is the title, because
Okay.
that was Sarah Potter's reading. So we did draw cards from our own tarot deck, and that became visually kind of the composite, and of course we kind of interpreted it, so we had our own internalized visual readings that we did and created the paintings, and then Sarah Potter would actually read the painting.
And we should talk about the process of making these, that by that time we had the deck, right? So we had made the deck and it had been editioned. I have it in my hand. And so when we were making choices about color and things or composition, we would actually ask the tarot. So we would line up the paint and we would do it in a completely different way.
Because of course we couldn't agree on what color,
so we would ask, and the tarot, so the whole process was a divinatory process in the palette and everything like that.
And as far as our process was concerned, we kind of just lived and breathed by the tarot. So any major decisions that we would take, if we came to an impasse, we would always consult the tarot, and we stayed true to that. So even if we weren't quite, we're like, but it was like, no, that, we're gonna listen to the tarot. And of course, then that becomes about an interpretation of the tarot. Dannielle is a little bit better than me at this because she's been reading the tarot for years. And for me, it is, just in this incredible visual language with divinatory meanings. And so, but then there would be a conversation, but I think it means this, or it means that. But it became very kind of a collegial process, but really at the center of it was the tarot. And this is another of the paintings, and you can see the Queen of Wands, kind of going up the center of that. If you kind of know the cards, then you'll start to see the different symbols.
I should say all the cards and everything are on our website, so you can find that. You can find the meanings of them. They're kind of these poetic meanings. But if you look at a Rider-Waite deck, or if you have any familiarity with that, ours is inspired, as most decks are, off of that deck. And just for fun, I will say that I pulled a card for us. I tried to create a divinatory, we tried to infuse this, and I pulled the Ace of Swords, which is, aces many times are beginnings of things, and swords actually deal with like the intellect, ideas, many other things. They also cut both ways, right? Good and bad. So in some ways, I just love that we're sitting in a talk about some ways the birth of ideas in some sense. So that gives you a little bit of an example of, how we're thinking.
This is definitely a place for ideas and
yeah.
and conversations. Should we open up? Oh, did you want to talk about this? You want to talk about the show at the Elizabeth Foundation?
We'll talk about that quickly, yeah.
Yeah, because that was Corinne had come to this show. We had curated. Again, it just ended in February. It was an exhibition, a curated project that we did of 25 artists. Again, we like to say there were, 3.5 men in the show, but mostly women, non-binary and trans. Excuse me, the half man is part of a collaborative duo. It's a husband and wife. So, but it is kind of funny.
He was the only man alive. Oh no, that's not
true.
He
was the only.
There was one more.
There was Rico Gatson. But do you want to talk about the show a little bit?
Yeah. So I had written a proposal to curate a show, mostly on abstraction. This is at the Elizabeth Foundation in New York, and of course the pandemic hit, and 2 years passed, and our entire world passed, and. By the time the show was about to happen, I said to the curator, I just feel like we're in a completely different universe. And he said, I feel completely the same way. And I said, you know what, we're really involved with spiritualism and the occult and abstraction. And would you be interested that we could do something with Hilma's ghost? And they accepted it. So we curated a show of 25 artists.
Called Cosmic Geometries.
Called Cosmic Geometries. And so we'll just show you a few images. I think the main thing about this show is, again, we invited the witch we work with in, who we set a sacred space. And the show was completely curated by the tarot in a divinatory way, the layout. So we assigned a card for each artist, mostly major arcana. And then we did a process where we laid out the show. So of course this could be a complete disaster. I will say the night before, my husband sat me down, who's also an artist, and has worked in museums, and he said, I think this is a bad idea. He's like, he goes, this is going to be a disaster. It's going to look terrible. You're not going to be able to choose anything, right? And so, but we stayed true with the process. And
actually, this is a nice example of a pairing that was, again, chance, but this is Grace Genero, an artist who lives in Maine, and she works with the Fibonacci series, which is a system of mathematics that came from India, and it really is about dualisms and binaries, and she was paired with the Lovers, which more than romantic love is actually about duality, and she just found that pairing. I mean, she was just so tickled by that. So there's, and also, like, if you see the show, I think you may have seen this as well, there's just a lot of visual rhyming happening, like things that we couldn't have imagined.
Yeah.
Can you show that? And so,
which one?
The install image, and then we'll start. I will say a funny part is, so we had, again, like, one thing about Hilma's Ghost is really about connecting to other women artists and community and the spirit of feminism. And again, we had an amazing response to the show. And we worked with Sarah, who again, did different rituals with us. And, the funny story is we would do these prosperity rituals with her, and she would say, what do you want? And we'd be like, well, the New York Times, and for this or that, and big, dream things. This space doesn't get so much attention. It's a small nonprofit on 39th Street in Manhattan, and sure enough, both times we did that, we ended up getting a New York Times review, and in the New York Times review, it said a spectacular knockout of a. They had never actually.
And this was the image. This is the image that
they
this
never
is the
even
image they
review
used.
group shows usually. So it was like, and it was a giant image of the show. So it's been kind of amazing. Just the critical response to it has been really wonderful.
But I think fundamentally we're always kind of asking for kind of attention to the community, prosperity for the community.
We weren't in the show.
Yeah, we were not in the show, except through the tarot. And this is just a future project. We'll just talk, just say it's in 2 minutes, and then we'd love to talk to you. So this is an exhibition that's coming up this summer at the Hamptons Museum in Connecticut. And why the space is particularly interesting to us is that it was founded and designed and built by this woman you see here, Theodate Pope Riddle, who was quite, she was very accomplished. She was one of the first licensed, female architects in the country. She built this estate for her parents, who had a huge impressionist and post-impressionist collection. And she almost drowned in the sinking of the Lusitania, and she was actually sent to the morgue. Where she was obviously alive, and she became a spiritualist and deeply embedded in these ideas and held seances with other women, including the artist Mary Cassatt, who is also mentioned in the film. And there's a library here of the automatic writings that she did in these seances. So we will actually be using some of these ideas. These are two of the books we're reading now. One of them is here. Written by a major theosophist, Dr. Annie Besant. And this is an exhibition that happened around, mediumship and these, artists, mostly women artists who used mediumship in their work. So those are the kind of ideas that we are going to be working with.
So we're
going to be doing some.
To do automatic drawings and, working in different ways through mediumship. And we'll go on a research trip. And maybe, I think it's next week, actually, we go. So, and we'll see what happens. We never know what's going to happen in these experiences. And I just want to say on the decks, we will have a box sent to the store here, but we brought 4 decks out of our collection. So if anyone wants one, that we can sell them to you. So
you can come and see us afterwards.
That was a sales pitch, and that's fine.
That was.
Any questions? Yes.
Sorry, there's somebody over here. Oh, sorry. Oh, no.
I'm sorry. Is it okay? Yeah. Go ahead.
I have been doing automatic drawings for quite a long time, and I have been very quiet and shy about showing them to anyone. I too was blown away by the show, and then saw the film soon after. When I came home, I watched the film after the show. Anyway, I'm sorry to be speaking out loud. It's just that I'm grateful to have seen you here to speak about this group that you formed. And
Well, please reach out to us, and if you go to @HilmasGhost, it is really about
On
exposing
Instagram.
those ideas in every way, and again, like those ideas of spiritualism infused in abstraction, which obviously have been infused forever. It's interesting, like, people, we hear that all the time. And, we were very shy about putting this out too. I'm a professor at uni. I'm making tarot cards. I'm on line with mediums at this point. I'm like, whatever. I have tenure, it's okay. So, but
I don't,
but it
but,
definitely, we were quite a little shy ourselves. And we were joking last week about, I was like, we should do this with color magic and that. And I said, oh my God, a year and a half ago, I would have actually been embarrassed to say that. But now we're completely in. Hi.
Hi.
So, the film was terrific, but I've got a question for you relative to the essence of how you consider the documentary in the film. And at one point, they note how the artist was not very social, but at one point she attends a social affair, and I'm wondering how it was stated in the documentary that did she say that she considered herself a clown at that point, or is this documentary? Is this documentary? How did that come up where in the film it says that she depicted herself as a clown? I would argue that unless she herself said it, but please.
Well, I think that was an image that looked like she was in costume for some kind of event, right? But I think that, we tell ourselves neat little stories about artists, especially women artists who didn't fit in neatly into things. And I think this idea that she was isolated and this crazy this is my own personal feeling on this, that she was this crazy mystic.
Did she state that she herself was
No.
No,
And that she was this crazy, that, I think that notion, and I think the film in some ways kind of brings that out a little bit. I think that is ridiculous because, people like Kandinsky and Mondrian and on and on who explored spiritual ideas deeply were never thought about, they were never portrayed as being isolated in some way. They were engaged in a very cross-cultural ideas of theosophy and a lot of other ideas that were coming into Europe at that time.
And she also had very
so
close
it's always
female
interesting
friendships.
to me to hear that, yeah.
Yeah, clearly.
Yeah.
Because
I think that's a really important
that is
point.
flawed. I think that statement, it flaws her. Unless she said it herself.
No, I don't think they said
that seriously flaws her.
That statement in the film that she said that her family, of course, didn't know what to do with her. And I found that very funny because I tell my students, if your family's liking your work, you're probably not doing very well. I tell my art students. So of course, but and I think her family thought she was very tight-knit or, and that image was her, of course, being very playful, but I think we don't need that image to know who she is. I mean, it's clearly that she had all these relationships and a really, a huge social life and in a collaborative way.
Yeah, I'm also going to put on my art historian's hat a little bit right now and say that, the film also states much more that she had these close female friendships and had these groups. And so she was certainly not antisocial at all. And she was deeply engaged with the ideas of the time, with theosophy, which Kandinsky, Mondrian, Paul Klee were all very vested in. The film actually doesn't say that she said that. It was the Swedish novelist showing that image, and we don't have enough context around that image to really say what it was, but there's an existing image of her in this costume. And so I think it was shown in the film as a way of saying that, she wasn't just kind of like this deadbeat and kind of hidden away from people, that she clearly also had a sense of humor. She just wasn't this stiff upper lip that, that stories make her out to be and isolated, that she was social and she was out, and she clearly also had a sense of humor, you know? Yeah.
I mean, I also just want to say, I find it absolutely amazing that you have a woman who never married, never had children, lived
Chose
in
not to.
isolation in the woods, and had maybe a female sponsor. And there's no speculation on her sexuality, maybe being like possibly a queer woman, maybe. I mean, to me, I just look at that and I think like, why is there no discussion around that or speculation? It's like obvious in some ways. And I mean, maybe there's no documentation on that, but I just look at that and I think, that's so bizarre that that never even comes up, you know,
Phil
so.
left that out also.
Yeah, the film
It
leaves
suggests
out
it, though,
too.
in a funny way.
It kind of suggests it.
But it leaves it out, you
But
know?
it's interesting, you know, again, like we tell ourselves these neat stories, and of course the reality is much more nuanced in a lot of ways.
Right. And I think what was just remarkable is that, you know, a woman who was very educated, who, you know, knew about science, but also chose to investigate into spiritualism. And I think it relates so to our times, and that's why I wanted to have you here tonight and see how that sort of spirit continues or has been revitalized in today's time. And I think specifically during the pandemic, I think it really has something to do with the times we're living in.
Absolutely. And I just think there's been a complete reshuffling.
There's one more question.
Hi,
Yeah.
Dannielle, I use she, her pronouns. Thank you so much
Hi.
for sharing your work and your process. As someone who's just begun to explore my own practice in magic and spiritualism, I'm curious as to how your own practice, if you have one, has informed your work and how you've gone about finding and determining your own rituals, and as well in your professional world, whether there's been more openness recently to that.
In my professional world, there's been work, I just didn't hear that last part.
If there's been more openness to, I guess, talk about magic and spiritualism and things like that.
I think there is, and I think first of all, there's an incredible amount of information, which of course I'm sure you're starting to find out there, and our website has all of the workshops we've done with every practitioner. Tarot workshops, they're all free. You could they're right on Vimeo. If you write to us, I have a reading list I can send out. But yes, I will say that it is infused, like it used to be, I had a painting practice and I had a somewhat of a spiritual practice, you know, and I would do some things with tarot and things like that. Now I would say they've fused a little bit more, and I've inched getting a little bit more public about these things. I will say, you know, when you've gotten great press for the year, it helps being public about these things. When I can send it to my dean of science, and I can say, look, it's the New York Times, the New York Times. That certainly helps, you know. But, you know, I do think there's more openness, but I will say I do think there's a lot of pushback, and I do think because a lot of this was like, it's a lot of like feminist-based knowledge that is continuously suppressed by most religions. That's the pushback, you know, and it's still very much in place, you know. So there is absolutely backlash in every way that, oh, you're doing new agey things or spiritual things or witchcraft things. And I think that, of course, it's dismissed, absolutely, you know.
And it's great to bring it back. I mean, you know, abstraction was often seen as, you know, a result of the hyper-rationale society. And I think bringing that back, and that's what she combined. She was like unique in that she combined abstraction with the spiritualism.
And I love the quote of Hilma in this, is that you have to ignore your fear. So amazing. I mean, you have to ignore your fear and to live an authentic life. In spirituality, in making art, in everything. And so I think that's just really interesting to hear that from her, and really inspiring.
I think that's the nicest closing remark.
Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you so
much. Such a nice conversation.